Today is Wednesday, April 26, 2017, and today I want to talk about the Confederate monuments being removed in New Orleans. Now, many have said that these monuments, now one of them is called Liberty Place, and they said that it's to commemorate the removal of a biracial government to put in a white government. I'm not sure how true or false that is, and I don't really know the ins and outs of that whole situation, but they removed that first, and they put on bulletproof vests, which is kind of like overkill. And really that right there is kind of like a dog whistle. You see him wearing bulletproof vests and the press reports on it. So it's like, okay, they got to wear the bulletproof vest to prevent the so-called white supremacists from being able to snipe them or something like that while they're removing the monument. But I digress. They're also going to remove a monument of other people, including Robert Lee, obviously the Confederate general. Now, this has come about, of course, because people are saying that these statues and monuments represent white supremacy. They represent oppression of blacks, a violent history of slavery, this, that, and the third. But really what it is like revisionist history. Some of you have told me that this is like them trying to erase history and like it never happened. But in my mind, it's revisionist history. Because when you remove these monuments, when you say, okay, the Confederacy, it represented white supremacy, it represented slavery, it represented racism, this, that, and the third. When you say that, you ignore the whole situation. You ignore context. You ignore everything, and you put it in favor of the side that won. That is called revisionist history. That's Marxism. That's what's going on here, because they want to say Robert Lee, who was a Confederate general, they might say he was a slaver as well. They say, okay, we're going to remove him because he's a symbol of what we hate. You know, he's a slave owner. He was the Confederate general. But what about Grant? Right? Ulysses S. Grant also had slaves, and he freed his after Lee freed his. The North had slaves too, because like that's the whole thing. People say, oh, the Confederacy represented the South and they're fighting for slavery. The North was trying to fight them to end slavery, but that doesn't make any sense because the North had slaves throughout the entire war, and the North had slaves after the war. The North had slaves for 2 years after they told the South to free theirs. Because let's get back to real history. Let's not get into the revisionist history that's going on right now with the removal of the Confederate monuments. The emancipation only applied to states in rebellion, which means that the states that formed the Confederacy. How is anybody going to tell me, just a regular common sense guy that looks at things black and white, that the North was trying to fight the South to free their slaves when the North had slaves throughout the entire war? The North did not free their slaves until December of 1865. That is when the 13th Amendment came into existence. That is almost 3 years after they told the South to free their slaves, right? And that only came about after the Civil War was over and after the reunification was going on. So this whole narrative about the North, and then they say, oh, the North only had a few slaves. Well, they had them in 5 states. In Kentucky, in December 1865, they freed 60,000 slaves at once. That's only a little bit, and that's just in one state. They also had slaves in West Virginia, which is where I'm from. I'll get to a little bit later. They had them in Missouri, Delaware, and maybe Maryland. I know it was 5. I'm not quite sure about Maryland, but I know Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri for sure. They were the so-called border states. That's the way they justify it. They say, oh, well, they're just right on the border. It's like a buffer zone, but that's not really true. Let's talk about West Virginia. Now, West Virginia was part of the Confederacy when it seceded in 1861. But West Virginia always wanted to become its own state because they're very far away from Tidewater, which is where I'm at right now. To drive from Canal County, which is the capital where I was born, to here in the East Coast in Hampton Roads, where I'm at right now, it's about 6.5 hours to drive. And that's over 64, 77, you know, these with a car and with very well constructed and engineered roads. Now, imagine back in the 1800s where there was no cars. You had to walk or, you know, horseback or some stuff like that. Maybe a train, maybe at that point. Imagine how long that took. And then you also got to go over a mountain range. It's very treacherous. It's treacherous to drive right now, even with very well constructed roads. So imagine how it was back then. It was very far away. So they had that bright idea to secede away from Virginia and become West Virginia. When they did that, they had slaves, many of whom were in Canal County, which is where I come from originally, working in the coal mines and the salt mines. And they went into the Union with slaves. So If the North was trying to fight against the spread of slavery, if they were trying to fight against slavery, why would you allow the state to come from the Confederacy into the Union with slaves? And here's how I'm going to advance the story and bring it on back home to the Confederate monuments being removed and how it's revisionist history. When they seceded into the Union with their slaves, Union soldiers came from Ohio and said, hey, if your slaves tried to escape into Ohio, we will return them, because they had a law in the books that said they do not accept any fugitive slaves. They were anti-fugitive slave state. And many other states in the North had that same law. So basically you couldn't escape from the South into the North just any old way. That's why they had the Underground Railroad, right? Because it didn't need to be underground. It didn't need to be in secret if the North just allowed any old person to come in, right? If you were a slave and you ran away, you were considered a fugitive. And many states in the North, they would extradite you back to the South. So if they were so loving, if they were so anti-slave, why did they have slaves in 5 states throughout the whole war and didn't free them until after the war was over? And why did they not allow any fugitive slaves to come into the state if it was a free state? Because Ohio did not have slaves, but they also did not want fugitive slaves to come there and become free. So we got to keep that in mind when you're talking about how bad the South was and how good the North was. It's not really true, you see. And then once you start to kind of dig into it and understand what's really going on, you got to look at everything and just destroy that as well. I mean, do we destroy Mount Rushmore because it contains slave owners? Right? Do we just look at the American flag? Because let's be clear here, the Confederacy only existed for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. That is it, and that is all. So slavery only existed under their banner for 4 years. There was never a Confederate flag flown on a slave ship. It was always either the Union Jack or whatever whatever Britain was at a certain period of time between 1611 and 1776. And from 76 up until 1865, you had the flag of the United States, the beautiful stars and stripes behind me. So if anything, that flag should be what you are fighting against, or the Union Jack of the UK or Great Britain or whatever it is, rather than the Confederate flag, which is only around for 4 years. People want to say, oh, it was co-opted as a symbol of racism, of hatred or whatever by the KKK, but the KKK also flew the American flag. The KKK also will wear crosses and they will burn it. So it doesn't make any sense. You have racist organizations and groups that usurp certain symbols into their whole narrative, but somehow those symbols are not seen as racist, but the Confederate flag is. A lot of it is just marketing, and it's a poor job of it. And it gives people the wrong impression about what this country was and how far we've come and who were the real enemy. And it paints just the wrong picture of what happened during history. This is why I call it revisionist history, because when you do things like this, when you have provocative messaging, symbols of people wearing bulletproof vests to remove a Confederate statue in New Orleans, you send in the message of, white hate, white resentment towards people that are trying to remove their heritage or whatever it is. But people are upset, not to the point of trying to shoot you, but people are upset because you're trying to change the way history is. You're trying to revise history and make it appeal to those that are on the other side, that are on the winning side. I had an argument with a white liberal about this, and I was talking about how both sides of the war had their own problems with slavery and racism or whatever it is. And the person asked me, well, if you were a black person in the 1800s, where would you rather go, the North or the South? I'm like, see, that's somebody right there that's been indoctrinated by the Marxism, by the revisionist history. You're thinking that the North is somehow this grandiose place and the South is just a cesspool of nothing. But the truth is, most blacks to this day still live in the South. It cracks me up. People talk about Mississippi and they talk about how racist it is and how it's like a white supremacist haven. But Mississippi is a very diverse state. Little known fact, it's only about 59% white and like 34% black and a very high Hispanic population. Compare that to a place like Illinois, which is like maybe 11 or 12% black at best. And most all of them live in Chicago. And look how bad Chicago is compared to somewhere like in the South. Look at the extreme violence and the chaos and how segregated it is, you see? And the person getting back to them asking me, where would you rather live? I'm like, well, it depends on my situation. First of all, 90% of people that try to escape slavery fail. So you got to be able to have a solid plan to be able to escape, first of all. Second of all, you got to be able to go to a place. You got to have a connecting the Underground Railroad or something like that, a safe house to live in or something in the North, because again, you had anti-fugitive slave laws in the North, namely Ohio. If I was in West Virginia, which is where I'm from originally, if I'm in Canal County and I'm trying to escape, where am I going to go? In the 1800s or during the war, matter of fact, where am I going to go? Can you say I'm gonna go to the North and escape? First of all, if it's during wartime in West Virginia, I'm in the North and I'm a slave, right? If I was actually a slave and not a free black. If it was during the war and I was not free, I was a slave, obviously, and I'm in the North. If I try to escape to Kentucky, that's a slave state right there, also in the North. If I try to go back to Virginia, that's a slave state and it's in the Confederacy. If I try to go to Ohio to the North, that is a free state, but they do not accept fugitive slaves. They will return me back to West Virginia, and I might not even go to the same place I went to. I might have to walk or try to catch a ride back to somewhere. I'd be in the worst situation because they caught me. Now I'm like, I've committed an offense. So you got to think about stuff like that. It's not so cut and dry. And that is the result of trying to revise history by removing these monuments. It's similar to what ISIS is doing right now, trying to destroy some of those monuments over in the Middle East, the real ancient structures, trying to change what was going on. I've heard that the Sphinx's nose got blown off because it was wild or whatever. I'm not sure if that's true or false, but if that's true, that is also revisionist history. That's going on right here with these statues being removed. Now, I'm not a proponent or opponent of the Confederacy, but I will say this as a guaranteed fact that nobody can dispute and nobody can disagree with or come with a counter argument that makes any sense. If the Confederacy did not succeed, then slavery would not have ended as soon as it did. And that is a guaranteed fact, because if it was not for the Confederacy succeeding, there would be no reason to end slavery. The North was not in the rush to end slavery because, like I said, they ended slavery after the South was ordered to free their slaves by the North. There was no rush to end it. The reason why it ended was because of the fracture in the nation. The North was perfectly fine for hundreds of years being able to indulge in slavery, if not themselves, then from the money that came from slavery. They were perfectly fine to be able to do that. They had no problem with it. It was all good. The only time they were really concerned about slavery and trying to eliminate it was when it made sense for them to do it in a strategic sense during war because of the Civil War that was going on. It was a tactic to use to win the war and get the South back into the Union. That is it, and that is all. So you should be thanking the Confederacy for ending slavery earlier than it would have ended. If it was not for the Confederacy, you would have had slavery probably about 20 more years until it became less financially advantageous to do so. Just like Brazil, it ended in like the 1880s. That just made sense because it didn't make any sense anymore. It was not economically advantageous to do so, and there was no war necessary to end it. And slavery was much more brutal south of the border, for sure, especially in Brazil. You had a very high mortality rate because they work you to death. They work you like an animal. And it was not quite the same way here in the U.S. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. All I'm going to say about this is, again, I'm not necessarily a proponent or opponent of the Confederacy. I look at things black and white. I know that if they did not succeed, slavery would have ended a lot later than what it did. And I know that if you try to remove these monuments, you're going to revise history. You're not going to understand the full context of what was going on. You're going to think one side was a perfect angel and the other side was a demon. And that can be very dangerous when you're talking about things that are happening right now. When you try to compare them to things that happened before, you're not really going to understand what you're talking about until you understand the full scope of history. Just like the guy that was trying to tell me, oh, you should go to the North rather than live in the South. Well, what am I going to do when I get to the North? How am I going to get there? Will they accept me? It wasn't no welfare, EBT, food stamps, nothing like that. So I got to be able to have skills. Can I read? Do I know how to do anything? If I go to the North with no skill, and if I go to the North in a place where they don't accept me, where I'm a criminal, where I'm a fugitive, then I'm just out back. So you got to think about stuff like that. And if you don't have the full scope of history, you won't be able to. So what do you think? Do you think that the Confederate monument should be removed because they're a symbol of racism? They are a symbol of hatred, etc., etc.? Now, if you believe that, do you also understand that you're opening the door to a lot of other things? What things do you like in your life that have come as a result of any kind of slavery, anything like that? Aren't there black families that had slaves? Is your great 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 grandfather, was he a slaver and he was black? Has your family been able to benefit from that? There's a lot of rich black families out there that have had money for many generations. Are you one of them that was able to benefit off of the ills of slavery? How about the American flag? Do you like it? Well, if you're going to say the Confederate battle flag was wrong, then what about the American flag? It flew atop of slave ships. It was on plantations for about 90 years. And then before that, it was a Union Jack of the Kingdom of Great Britain or UK or whatever it was. Or do you pretty much think I'm on point with my assertion that this is revisionist history and it's a slippery slope? You know, the next thing you know, they're going to send a cannonball to Mount Rushmore and destroy that because George Washington was a slave owner. And many other things are going to get desecrated as a result. I mean, I'm already starting to see it happen. I've seen people talk about how the American flag is the real enemy and how America is this, you know, just disgusting place. Every nation in the world has their flaws and has a dark past, but all you can do is just, as a collective, work toward making the country better. And trying to revise history, in my opinion, will not get that done. But that's all I got to say about it. Whatever your comments are, let me know in the comments below. And that's all I got to say for this video. If you like what you heard, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.